So, critical thinking skills. Let's first think about what critical thinking is. So, while I pull up my slides, if you can give me a quick, simple, it's hard to do this simply, but simple definition of critical thinking in the chat box, let's see what you come up with. Can you all see my slides? Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for the feedback. All right, so we've got some answers coming from different people. Let's see. So Asma says critical thinking is about solving problems. You're not wrong at all. Very good. Analyzing, Joanna, yes. Analytical skills, yes. Michaela, yes. Hi, lovely to see you again too. Kotorova, using common sense when presented with information. I like the fact that it's about what we do and how we think when we are being presented with information. That's really, really important. Common sense, however, isn't always very common. Is it common? Is common sense common? Uh, Questioning skills, Orlando, absolutely, yes. Thinking outside the box, I like that, Juba. Okay, being able to analyze. So the word analyze has come up a few times. Understanding, yeah, understanding is definitely part of it, and how we choose to understand this information that we've been presented with is a huge part of critical thinking. Analyzing, evaluating, and then communicating your opinions. Thank you very much, Saha. Some really good definitions here. Now let's have a look at one of the so-called official definitions of critical thinking that was given at a critical thinking and educational reform international conference back in 1987. So Scriven and Paul says critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process. This already sounds very highly academic, of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. That sounds extremely academic, extremely complicated, but we can see some keywords that you have already mentioned here, like analyzing, evaluating, and also not to forget things like reflecting on our own thoughts, our own experience, observation when being presented with information that might come in many different forms, and communicating those thoughts, those opinions to others, and also listening and understanding what others are communicating to us. So let's put this really simply. According to Emma Sue Prince, who wrote the wonderful book Seven Skills for the Future, and I've got it right here, really, really great book. Totally recommend that you read it. And Emma Sue Prince has obviously critical thinking as one of the key seven skills that she says will be important for the future. And her definition of critical thinking here, put simply, is making an evaluation or judgment about what we see or hear about facts or a situation presented to us. So it's a bit like what you said earlier about the information that's being presented to us. And this information might be a website, it might be a news article, it might be gossip that we hear from a friend, or even a situation, not necessarily information, but a situation that's happening right now that's being presented to us. So it's about how we evaluate and make judgments when hearing about this. And the origin of critical thinking dates all the way back to Socrates, who identified that our natural human tendency is to justify answers to questions based on emotions or impulse thinking rather than a logical or reasoned response. And I think I really want to emphasize that this is not just something that happened hundreds of years ago. This is something that we still do and probably do a lot of these days because of the amount of information that we're constantly exposed to through social media, through the internet. And in order to process that information quickly, we tend to make judgments very much based on our feelings, our emotions, impulsive thinking, rather than having the time to logically consider what we understand from the situation, from the information, and form a reasoned response. So Emma Sue Prince says a shocking amount of thinking that we do today is actually very much biased and uninformed and probably based on emotions and impulse thinking. As we said, in a busy life, our brain has no time to process everything. And information is coming to us in so many different ways. Our brain has to find shortcuts, different ways to make sense of all this information that we've been given. And so we've become used to this light approach, this fast, easy shortcut that allows us to make decisions and make judgments on situations and evaluate if something is good or bad or a threat, whether to fight or flight, quickly, based on emotions, based on impulse thinking. And that can't be very good because, as we know, there is a lot of fake news out there, and sometimes basing our decisions just on our emotions might lead us down the wrong path to the wrong conclusions. Now, Bloom's taxonomy is a great way of looking at critical thinking by breaking the concept down into several cognitive skills. So right at the bottom of this pyramid, we see remember. So helping students to remember what they've read, remember what they've listened to, remember what they've learned, and then helping them to understand it. So not just repeating what they've heard, but actually understanding what they've heard. Maybe we might do this by asking students to summarize an article with a partner to make sure they've fully understood it. But understanding alone is not enough. We want them to be able to apply it. As they say, give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he eats for a lifetime. So we want them to be able to apply what they've understood. I mean, as language teachers, we know the difference between understanding and learning about the present perfect and actually being able to use the present perfect. Two different things there. But as we move further up the pyramid, we realize that it doesn't stop at applying. We've got analyzing information, which several of you have mentioned in the chat field, evaluating information, critiquing it, understanding, what if we did this? What if we did that? The pros and cons. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, being able to create, design, innovate in order to make something and develop something of our own based on the information we've been given. Now, all these make up critical thinking skills, but as we can see, the lower parts of the pyramids are what we call lower order thinking skills. And traditionally in education, this is what we're very used to doing with students, right? Getting students to remember and recall what they've read, what they've learned in the last lesson, checking that they understand using concept checking questions, for example, getting them to apply by doing some gap fills. But what we're trying to get students to do more of is perhaps getting them to push that further to higher order thinking skills like analyzing the information, evaluating it, and then perhaps creating something of their own. Now, using the chat field, would you say, if you're thinking about how teacher-centered or student-centered each of these phases might be, would you say that lower order thinking skills are more teacher or student-centered, or teacher or student-led? And when it comes to higher order thinking skills, would you say they tend to be teacher or student-centered? Just using the chat field, what do you think? Which type of skills tend to be teacher-led or teacher-centered, and which kind of skills tend to be student-centered? I've got lots of answers coming in. Masissa says for lower order thinking skills, more teacher-centered. Yes, so does Michaela. Pinky as well says lower order is teacher-centered. Of course, both can be teacher-led, Orlando, to answer that. Both can be teacher-led, but which one tends to focus more on what the teacher says, teacher standing up there, and which one really is a focus on student, right, student-centered. If we look over here, we can see that the higher order thinking skills, like many of you have suggested here, are more student-centered the higher up we go. And the ones right at the bottom, simply asking students to memorize, duplicate, repeat, define, tend to be more teacher-led, right? Teachers stand up there, explain, get students to understand, so on and so forth. So let's see how this applies when developing critical thinking skills in the language classroom. Now, to understand critical thinking skills, perhaps it is best that we divide them into subskills because critical thinking is huge. It encompasses so many different skills. So what different subskills are we really talking about? So here's a quick summary, and then we're going to look at them in a bit more detail. We've got analytical skills. Very often critical thinking and analytical thinking are used almost synonymously because thinking critically is the ability to analyze the information we receive. So analytical thinking is often used to talk about critical thinking. They are slightly different, but analytical thinking is definitely a subskill of critical thinking. And then we have the ability to do research and to formulate reasoned judgment, problem-solving skills, decision-making skills, reflective thinking, the ability to reflect, open-mindedness, and communication skills, the ability to communicate our opinions, our ideas, but also to listen and understand the ideas and the perspectives of others. Joanna, you're absolutely right. We simply can't just divide the skills between teachers and learners. Absolutely. And hopefully by the end of today's talk, we can see the role of teachers in helping to develop those critical thinking skills with students. So let's have a look at the first one, analytical skills. Right, what are analytical skills? It is about helping students to look at complex information and complex issues and break them down into manageable chunks, or what we teachers call scaffolding. To help students recognize the relationships between two different parts of a text, for example, the cause, the effect, the whys, the reasons, the patterns and trends in the data they're looking at, making connections. And absolutely, yes, Fatma, making connections to real life as well, and evaluating the strength of the arguments presented to us and looking for evidence that support those arguments. Absolutely. Why is analytical thinking so important? The World Economic Forum has just recently released its Future of Jobs Report 2025 that looks at skills needed between 2025 to 2030. And this was taken from the report. As you can see, the top skill that all companies surveyed felt was important to the future of the workplace is analytical thinking skills, skills that will help our students get employed, analytical thinking. But analytical thinking is not the only critical thinking subskill that we see here. We also see a related skill at number 4. We've got creative thinking, but often very related to critical thinking. If you remember that Bloom's taxonomy pyramid, creating, inventing, designing, producing was at the top of that pyramid, create. And that has a lot to do with critical thinking, creative thinking. And we can also see from number 8, curiosity and lifelong learning. Curiosity helps push our students to want to know more, to find out about the other perspective, to dive deeper into thinking about issues and not simply rely on those impulsive one-moment judgments. But right now, we're looking at analytical thinking and that top most important core skill in 2025. Now, we can see here a infographic, which is one way of presenting information in a palatable, easy to digest sense to our students. So we see a infographic here presented to students, and then we ask questions to enable them to break the information down into manageable chunks. And how do we do this? We do this in the form of questions. So if you look right next to the infographic on the left, we have 4 discussion questions. It says, discuss with a partner. Starting with the first question, which food group in the infographic do you eat most of? Which do you eat the least of? Here we're really breaking it down to something really easy for them to answer. Students are basically using their own experience and answering the question, a very factual question that doesn't require too much in-depth thinking, right? Let's just recall and reflect which of these food groups do we eat the most of, least of. So we're asking them about their experience. Then we move on to question number 2, which do you waste the most? And we're going from very factual, experiential talk to actually getting them to really now go a bit deeper and reflect on their experience. Which do you waste the most? And then number 3, why do you think people, restaurants, and supermarkets waste food? Again, we're going even deeper now, asking students for their opinions and thoughts. And number 4, what do you think governments and individuals can do to reduce food waste? Here, we're pushing them to that top level of that Bloom's pyramid. Create. Can you innovate? Can you create suggestions? Can you create and find innovative solutions to the problem of food waste? Getting students to suggest, recommend, innovate, develop, create. And here, I want to focus on the power of the question. Earlier, one of you said, that distinction between what is student-led, teacher-led, student-centered, teacher-centered can be a complex one for sure. But in order to develop critical thinking skills, it is so important that we don't do the critical thinking for our students. For such a very long time, the role of the teacher was the fountain of knowledge. We stand at the front of the classroom, perhaps behind a lectern, and we do the thinking for our students. Our students, perhaps, especially in some areas where hierarchy is a big thing, might take the thinking of the teacher as their own. However, in order to develop abilities like analytical thinking with our students, we should not be analyzing for the students and then giving them the information to remember. After all, we are developing higher order thinking skills, not just remembering and lower order thinking skills. In order for students to actually develop higher order thinking skills, they need to be practicing higher order thinking skills like analyzing. So instead of doing the thinking for them and giving them the answer, ask them questions. Understand that the question is important. Ask them about their experience. Ask them to reflect on their experience. Ask them about the thoughts and opinions. And then get them to create and suggest solutions to those problems. Here are some other examples of questions that we can ask students. Just because we are not the fountain of knowledge in front of the classroom does not mean that our role is redundant. Our role is to ask questions that are useful, that can help to personalize the topic, to make the topic interesting, but also to help them analyze and break the information down into manageable chunks. Absolutely. Nellie, why questions make students think critically? Let me expand on that even further, perhaps not just why questions, but open-ended questions, questions that don't have a yes or no answer, questions that are open so that students can really dig deep and reflect and think. Here's some questions that I formulated according to these different skills on the Bloom taxonomy. So at the bottom, lower order thinking skills. Remember, we might ask questions like, what is it? Who is it? Where is it? When is it? Can you list 3 of that? Can you recall this? Can you identify that? Getting them to check their understanding might require them to describe or explain what's happening and say what the main idea is and summarize. Getting them to apply what they've learned might involve them explaining the approach they would choose and why they've chosen this. But then as we move further up that into higher order thinking skills, we're asking questions like, what's the relationship between this and that? What is the cause of this? What are the reasons for that? Why do you think? What's the function? What evidence is there for you to believe that? What's your opinion of it? What if, the very big hypothetical, what if? What would happen if this was done? And then at the top of the pyramid, what can you produce? What can you invent? What's an original way to do this? So moving from analytical skills to research and reasoned judgment, getting students to explore for themselves. When students ask us a question, instead of giving them the answers, getting them to find the answers for themselves and do their own research, to discover what is reliable and what's relevant amongst all those sources of information that they're bombarded with online, to objectively be able to analyze that information and evaluate how credible is it. Is it fake news? Is it not? Considering the multiple perspectives and synthesizing information, summarizing it from not just one source, but different sources, and then to make decisions based on logical inferences and sound reasoning, and not jumping to conclusions and judgments too quickly. So, for example, we could start really, really easily. We have a unit about shipping and how the world's goods are transported. Before we expose students to researching the World Wide Web, we might give them an article to read and then perhaps guide them through thinking critically in the article about, for example, the reasons why so many world's goods are transported by cargo ship and the positive changes, etc., negative changes. So we start with an article, a reading article, and getting them to think critically about the information given. Then we might move them towards bigger questions, questions that might not be found in the reading article, questions that might require students to go off in pairs, in groups, to discover and research the answers to these questions before formulating their own opinions and thoughts and suggestions based on the research they've done. Projects that require students to discover more and explore the topic more before actually forming a reasoned judgment about what's good and what's bad, what are the pros and what are the cons, and what should be the way forward. To do this, we need to understand the power of inquiry-based learning. Inquiry-based learning is learning that requires students to be curious, lifelong learning, a lifelong learning skill that requires students to go and find questions for themselves. But being able to do research and reason judgments means that students also need to be able to spot the fake stuff. Students need to know the ethos and the agenda that lies behind the authors or the person who produced that information, their intent. And in the talk after this, Rose will be talking a bit more about that. So please do stay for her talk. It's absolutely wonderful. But here's an example of how we can hold our students' hands and take them through step by step how we can understand and evaluate the claims that are given in an article or piece of information, and how we can look at such a claim and before evaluating the evidence given to us. The next subskill, the third one here, is problem-solving skills and decision-making skills. Getting students to understand when a problem is being defined and being able to brainstorm potential solutions, consider pros and cons of each option and reflecting on the outcome. Very important life skills. So we might have a problem such as this, a litter problem presented in a listening article, and getting students in groups, in pairs, to discuss the suggestions that were presented in the listening. And then most importantly, number 3 here, coming up with their own ways of stopping people from throwing litter in the street. So we have a clear problem, potential solutions, and then give me your own solutions structure, which you can do to practically any problem that you choose to highlight in class. Here's another one. We've got an article about food waste. Very often, we all know what it's like. We ask students a question and some students look at you and say, don't know. You say, give me some ideas. What are some solutions for this problem? Students say, don't know. I have no ideas. What do you do then? As teachers, we learn to scaffold information, so we should scaffold the development of critical thinking. Here, if you look at number 1, getting to students to brainstorm ideas and solutions from scratch can be really, really difficult. But instead, if we give them some ideas to start with, here you have some solutions, and then students are to mark the ideas from 1 to 8, very easy to very difficult. And then in exercise 2, they are then asked to work with a partner to add their own original ideas. Sometimes throwing students into the deep end and getting them to brainstorm ideas from scratch can be useful. Sometimes when students are new to developing critical thinking, there might be resistance. So offering them some ideas to get them started, to get them motivated and interested, might be easier than throwing them into the deep end and expecting them to swim. Here we need to also understand the power of working together, of collaborating. As we know from Vygotsky from a long time ago, the zone of proximal development, ZPD, we are much more powerful when we collaborate. We can come up and learn so much more when we work together. So putting students in pairs, in groups, and getting them to analyze and evaluate together. But it's also one thing about working together that it gives us. It allows us to be more open-minded. It allows us to hear different points of views and different perspectives, and then critically examine our own points of views, our own assumptions, our own biases. Always, of course, remembering to suspend judgment of the opinions of people we don't agree with until sufficient evidence is gathered. Critical thinking activities that we do in groups can help us to be flexible in updating our beliefs based on new information and continuously evaluating our own thought process and our own thinking process. Absolutely, Leslie. Students become more tolerant when they are used to working together. So here's an example of working together and getting students to reflect, right? You have an article about virtual labs, and you're getting students to really dive deep. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What kind of benefits can this result in? What is your opinion about this? But not just getting them to do it alone, getting them to work with a partner so that different opinions can come together and allow more critical thinking to happen. Of course, just thinking about facts alone can be useful, but we can't talk about critical thinking without talking about emotions, getting students to also reflect on their emotions. What surprised you? What interests you about this? What's your opinion? And what worries you about this? Getting students to really dive into those emotions, because awareness of their emotions will help them avoid those emotional impulse thinking judgments and help them to really, really think more critically and more in a more self-aware manner than if they had not considered their own emotions. Here we need to understand the power of facilitation. As I said, we teachers are so used to the concept of a teacher standing on a stage behind a lectern, lecturing and being the fountain of knowledge. We don't have to be the fountain of knowledge to teach critical thinking. What we need to be able to do instead is to help students understand that their ability to think critically is within themselves. And you, as the teacher, just have to guide them towards it. We are facilitators of developing the skill. We can't do it for them. In the same way that a driving instructor shouldn't be driving for the student to teach them to drive, they should be guiding them. We should be that guide towards them developing those critical thinking skills. And finally, the last subskill I have for today is communication. Being able to clearly express our thoughts, our emotions, our complex ideas, but also to be able to listen to information, to take in information, to ask clarification questions, to truly comprehend different aspects, different perspectives, different angles of that information. Here we have an example of an activity that requires students to work in small groups to communicate by writing an opening statement in a debate. Getting students to work together to communicate ideas to the rest of the class is a good way of getting everyone involved, communicating, and of course, practicing those essential language skills as they do so. To do this, we need to help students understand the power of diverse voices. Diverse voices exist in every classroom. Students have different opinions, they disagree, perhaps based on personality, different past experiences, different backgrounds, different communities they belong to. And this can be so powerful. Having different voices helps students to develop that tolerance of disagreeing, that tolerance of understanding different perspectives, but also the richness of the different perspectives can enable them to become more innovative and more productive as a team. So provide a safe space where students feel comfortable to offer their own opinions, even though their opinions might be unique and different to the opinions of others in the class. and give students that chance to consider different perspectives, because when we can take the perspectives of others, can we really think or help students to think critically? Active listening and understanding others isn't simply about understanding superficial surface meaning. It is also being able to infer the speaker's opinion. Why did the speaker say this? What evidence do they have for saying this? What is their intention? Do they have a hidden agenda? So, helping students to infer and identify the message that the speaker wants us to go away with. So there you have it, 5 different subskills that critical thinking consists of. Notice it's a Venn diagram, so there are overlaps. There are analytical skills needed when we're problem solving and making decisions. We need to be reflective and open-minded when we're doing that research and considering the evidence, as well as when we're communicating that information and those thoughts with others in an interaction. We need to communicate well in order to problem solve and make decisions together in a collaborative team. These skills overlap with each other, but they are all playing a huge part in thinking critically, and they're all part of developing those essential critical thinking skills for the language classroom. So I leave you with this: as educators, in order to develop critical thinking skills in the classroom for the future of our students, we need to understand the power of questions, asking questions, and getting students to be curious so that they can go and find those answers for themselves through inquiry-based learning, and allowing students to work together in pairs, in groups, to collaborate and find those answers together and then evaluate and innovate together. Understanding the power of facilitating learning, not doing it for them, not being the fountain of knowledge, but facilitating them and guiding them so that they find the answers for themselves. And finally, understanding the power of diversity and diverse voices. Having different opinions in the classroom can only help us to learn more and perhaps be more innovative